Hi guys, welcome back to the Earthly Delights podcast. Today we have a special podcast, just Jim and I, kind of going back to our roots. But we're going to be talking about what we've been seeing recently in the news and the worldwide movement of Black Lives Matter, and kind of the flashpoint of the George Floyd murder. And basically what we're going to do, guys, for people who are listening, we're not going to talk about the Black experience or how it feels to be a victim of racism, because obviously Jim and I could never do that justice. But what we are going to talk about is how it's made us feel as white males and white people, and what we think we could, personally and as a white society, do better to help the fight against racism, and to really make a permanent and substantial change, and to make sure that this moment in time is something that we can look back on in decades, and say that we were there and we did the right things, and led to a better society. But before we get on with any of that, obviously we have to start off with what's the crack. So Jim, what is the crack? How are we doing?
What's the crack, buddy? The crack is all right, man. This week has obviously been quite unique, I guess, strange, emotional, draining. I actually started a new job as well, so that's been taking a lot of my time, and then trying to really think about how I could best contribute to this situation. And of course, I want to do this podcast, and I'm just trying to think. I'm just, like, we were talking yesterday about how we could best do this podcast, and this is it. All we want to do is, we acknowledge that we can make some sort of an improvement on a personal level, and with people that we know. And we had a good chat yesterday, and I'm looking forward to having this chat today. What's the crack with you, buddy?
Yeah, no, exactly the same. Echo those sentiments. I mean, like we said, this podcast in some ways is the same as every other podcast, be it in the sense that, all we're doing is we're having this conversation to promote others to have the same kind of conversation within their own homes, within their own kind of friendship groups, which is what we do with every topic, I guess, that we have on this podcast. It's the reason why we started this podcast, right? Is to kind of bring quote unquote taboo topics into the light, and to make them less taboo, basically. And obviously racism has become a huge, has always been, I guess, a huge taboo topic amongst in the white society. Yeah, man, it's been difficult. I mean, I've luckily I grew up with loads of Nigerians, and so I kind of from a very young age had seen what it means to be black in Britain, and had seen racism at play. But then you get these flashpoints, right? And I think it's, especially as white people, it's easy to forget about it, because again, it doesn't affect us on our day-to-day lives. And then you get these flashpoints, and it just kind of brings those previous experiences that I've had kind of to the fore again. And obviously I've been speaking to my friends, and I spoke to Michael, who people who listen to the podcast will be familiar with, guy who we've had him on as a guest, and he's also the genius who's done all of our artwork. And it's the pain when I was talking to him. In fact, it took him a couple of days. I reached out straight away because I wanted to get his thoughts on the whole thing, and we've spoken about race before, and in fact we planned to have him on as a guest at one point, and we're not sure whether that will happen or not. But he actually didn't want to talk to me for a couple of days, just because he was trying to process it all. That's how much it affected him, obviously. And then when we did have a conversation, I think it was a very good conversation to have. And he, he kind of it was his idea to do this podcast, in the sense of for me and you to do it, because I reached out to him and I asked him if he had any recommendations for maybe people within his community who he thought would be good guests, who could talk eloquently and explain points to maybe a white listenership who maybe doesn't really reflect on those points so much. And he gave me a few names, and we'll be reaching out to those people and hopefully get some of them on in the future. But he also said, I really would recommend just you and Jim doing something To which I was at first really skeptical, because it's kind of the classic, oh, right, yeah, two white guys talking about racism. You see it all the time. I watch this show called The Sunday Supplement, and it's about football, and it's like a debate show every Sunday, and they just talk about like the weekly topics, and every now and again, obviously, women's football comes up, and it's the same thing. You have like a round table of like 50-year-old white men talking about sexism within football, and it kind of just always seems a bit off, right?
Yeah.
And so my initial reaction, and I think yours and many white people's initial reactions to this, is that, oh, I don't want to talk about it, it's not my place to talk about it, so on and so forth. And the more I spoke to Michael and the more I reflected on what he said, it became apparent that first and foremost, it's not a black problem, it's a white problem. That's first thing. Secondly, the racism won't be solved, or there won't be any fundamental change unless white people get on board, because ultimately white people are the ones that, in the systems that we live in, are the ones who mainly, by and large, are in power. And so if we aren't ready to relinquish that power, and maybe to relinquish some of our white privilege, then in some respects it's almost futile, just letting the black population across the world fight on their own. We need to fight with them. And then he said, and it's true, he said, maybe you having a conversation with Jim, you can talk about what the white experience within racism, what you've seen, what you've heard since you've since you were little, basically, and you don't need a black person to tell you those things, because obviously we've seen and heard those things firsthand, and we know what some white people think and say, and maybe we can use our own white privilege to have a conversation that maybe a listener who, let's say, is racist or of a racist persuasion might not listen to a black guest, but they might listen to us on the pure basis that we're white, which is obviously we don't condone. But if that's something that's the truth, which I'm sure it is in some cases, then we should definitely use our white privilege in this way. So yeah, it's going to be a hard conversation to have, but I think all the more necessary, really.
Just to put in, when you said that Michael had to take a few days to process it, I saw a tweet maybe 5 days ago that really knocked on this difficulty about being like, the tweet said something, I'm paraphrasing, something like, being black in the States or just being black here is seeing this, is having a good day and seeing someone of your race being choked to death because of their race. And then you have a choice. You have a choice to process it, like what Michael was doing, which takes a lot of time. It's incredibly draining. Or you start to become numb to it, which I'm sure other people are. And like, to be honest, man, I'm sure like a lot of people are, because it's just happening all the time. Like it's, and that's something that I just had to say also. You have to make it, it's like a decision, because it's real difficult to go, okay, I need to process this. I need to process what's just happened, because I think now we're just getting so numb to such violence, such racism, such calamities, that we often just become numb.
Yeah, I've tried, and also it brings up previous personal experience, right? I'm sure, traumatic events kind of resurface. I wrote about it in an article, in like kind of a piece that I put on the Earthly Lights podcast, which is called an Oyinbo's experience with racism. Oyinbo is a Nigerian word for like white people, which is what I kind of was affectionately known as, like their Oyinbo little brother in the boarding house, right? And there were some instances which I think I just want to like point out quickly here, because obviously some people might not have read the article, but for example, for someone like Michael, I mean, the boarding school was a kind of survival of the fittest situation, and I wouldn't have changed my experience for the world. I loved it, and it's made me who I am today, and I've made such great friendships that remain to this day from living in the boarding school, right? But there's certain aspects of the boarding school, which I think people who maybe didn't go to a boarding school don't appreciate. I think people think in general that like a boarding school is just like a place for a bunch of posh rich toffs, and we have everything served on a platter to us. But when you kind of start at boarding school, Jim, you're basically at the mercy of anyone who's older than you, anyone who's in a year group that's older than you. And as you know, when you start and you're 11 years old, like 16-year-olds, they look like giants, and so, you would kind of, it is bullying. Looking back on it, it's bullying, but I mean, it's just what the culture, you just had to go through it. So I, for example, would always get called pudding for being like a bit chubby, and they would pin you down if they felt like it, not all the time, but if they felt like it, they'd pin you down, chest tap you, petrol pump you, and any other form of like physical abuse. And Michael's was the year group above me, but Michael and I have been best friends since we met in boarding school. I think I was 11, he was 12 when we met. I think he joined in year 8, if I remember correctly. And one day we were walking, and we walked kind of like past the year 11's room, and they dragged us in, and I got the usual treatment. But for Michael, they reserved something a bit more, just vicious, basically. And they, instead of kind of dragging him down, they put him into their wardrobe. They left the wardrobe door slightly ajar, and they just emptied like 2 or 3 deodorant cans into the wardrobe. In effect, just gassing Michael out, really. And then they eventually let Michael out. And when he asked, like, what the hell was that for? Because I mean, it was completely unasked for. We literally only walked past the room. That was our only crime. They said, "Oh, because you're black." And so, I can only imagine that when something like this happens again and it resurfaces again, all of those traumas that you've lived obviously resurface. And I know that's not the only thing that Michael's had to deal with personally, and so you can't really imagine how hard it is. To be honest, you can't. You can try to empathize as much as possible, but I suppose that kind of speaks to the first point, I guess, of this podcast of what we can do as white people to maybe make things a bit better. And I was talking to him, and I was talking to a friend, Tommy, another Nigerian girl at boarding school, and we were talking about it. And I think we kind of agreed that the principal reason for racism is ignorance. And, there's 2 forms of ignorance. There's willful ignorance, where someone actually, actively stays ignorant to a certain topic, and then there's just kind of default ignorance, where because of your life experiences and where you've grown up and so on and so forth, you are ignorant to a certain aspect of life. So what I mean by that is, if you grew up in a very white dominated town, and your school was only had white people in it and so on and so forth, you may be ignorant to what it means to be a black person in Britain, or in Ireland in your case, I guess, Jim. And so what I found is that people who don't have black friends, it's not to say everyone, I'm just saying some people, right? Some people who don't have black friends, they see black people as other. So they talk about themselves, and when they talk about themselves, it's them, their friends and so on and so forth. But when they talk about black people or Muslim people, it's them. So it's us versus them. You know what I mean? And I think that kind of being able to disregard a whole community as them, and not being able to personalize those people and to see them as individual identities, lends itself to being able to make abhorrent statements that you wouldn't make about a specific person. Because when someone who is black or is Muslim personally, like their story, their life story, you've met their mum and dad, you've met their brothers and sisters, their hobbies and so on and so forth, to then kind of label, what are the negative black stereotypes, that they're all lazy, or that they're all aggressive, or so on and so forth, which is obviously nonsense. But I think it's easier to do that when you don't have a personal connection to them, to that group, because you kind of see them as an entity rather than, and it's ridiculous because we would never call white people a certain thing because of the color of their skin, because obviously we're all individuals and everyone's completely different, and the level of melanin in your skin has kind of no correlation with who you are as a person, right? And I've kind of been flipping backward and forward on this because I don't know what you think, Jim, and I don't know what your experience was growing up, but I've been thinking, look, I've been very privileged in the sense that I was sent to boarding school, and since the age of 11, I grew up. I mean, I literally lived with Nigerians day in, day out. Went to sleep, we would eat breakfast together, we'd play football together. I grew up with these people, and so I was privileged in the sense that I had that exposure, I guess is a way to say it. And so I didn't grow up ignorant, because from a very young age, I saw black people as individuals and not as an entity. And I don't know what specifically can be done necessarily if you are someone who maybe has grown up in a white background, or hasn't had exposure to multicultural life. What I don't know what your opinions are on that, Jim.
Well, when you initially said that you think the root cause of racism is ignorance, well, I agree. I watched. I basically watched an interview with Dia Khan, who is like a Norwegian British filmmaker, and she had an interview with Russell Brand, which is very interesting. But then I watched her documentary last night called White Right, and basically in the documentary she just meets up with leading figures of the alt-right movement in the States, and she's not aggressive. She's merely trying to understand what is behind this hatred, and I don't want to ruin the documentary, but towards the end, one of the leading figures that she was talking to ends up leaving the organization because he had the first experience of talking to a Muslim woman, and he must have had this realization, like, oh wow, this woman's lovely, she's a friend of mine, why am I, for no real reason, only that I don't know them, presuming these bullshit stereotypes. And then he was like, I'm sorry I left because I consider you a friend and you just happen to be in the Muslim faith. But sorry, I really recommend the documentary if anybody's interested. But I brought that up because also she talked to former heads or former prominent figures in the movement who have since left and since we're like completely done a 180 or a 360. And one of them said, it's so much easier to say I hate Jews and blacks and Muslims than to say I'm afraid of not being worthy of love. And he's like, I think it's different because I think there's a racism where you're not even like, you're just not really actively being non-racist. You're kind of just, seeing it be present, and then that's it.
You're apathetic towards it.
Yeah. But I think this guy is talking about the people who are incredibly angry people who are saying, I hate Jews, I hate Muslims, I hate black people. And his belief is that a lot of them are saying this because it's easier to say this than to say, hey, like, I'm afraid of not being worthy of who I really am. Because when she interviews these people, almost all of them are really concerned with being liked. And if you see, they surround themselves by other people in this movement because at least they'll feel liked then, And so this is by no means excusing their awful behavior and in some cases violence and murder and rape, etc. But it's just interesting because while I totally agree that ignorance has a huge part to play, it is interesting what role fear plays as well.
I mean, like in your growing up, Jim, obviously you grew up in Dublin. What was that like in terms of racially? What was that like? Did you grow up in a multicultural school and so on and so forth? Did you have multicultural friendships, or was it, predominantly white and so on? How was that for you?
It was predominantly white. And to be honest, like on reflection, when I was in school, in secondary school particularly, I was passive with the racist comments that happened to the minority kids in my school.
Yeah.
And it was the same thing. I just kind of wanted to be liked by the majority of people, and it's totally unfair and wrong that I didn't stop this behavior. And it's not an excuse either, but that is just the reason why I didn't stand up to the stuff that I saw, because I saw similar things to what you're saying happen to Michael. And I heard a lot of things, and to be honest, it was only in my late teens and when I went to university that I really attacked this, because I was lucky enough to go to university or have a course where we really tackle this post-colonial studies, and we studied the idea of whiteness, and it really did help me. And the last few years, I do see things with a completely different lens. And what about you?
I mean, yeah, like I said, I mean, obviously I grew up in the boarding school, and so that kind of definitely, thankfully, kind of impacted me for the better from a very, very young age. But that being said, it's not to say that I have always spoken out on racism when I've seen it. I've spoken out on it when I've had comments made personally to me. Another example I use is that, and I think this is really indicative of people who maybe aren't, how do I put this, aren't actively racist, I guess I would say, but whereby, so I left Skegness Grammar, which is where I was friends with the first and second generation Nigerian students, and I went to Cars Grammar. Both are in Lincolnshire, which anyone who's kind of familiar with that county it's a very rural, traditional, predominantly white county, okay, and all that entails. And this school that I joined, as much as I love my 2 years there, was basically completely white. If I'm not mistaken, there was only one mixed race student in the whole school, unless I'm forgetting someone. I think that is the case. And in my year, there wasn't anyone of any. Well, there wasn't any black students at all. Anyway, so I joined this school, and I'm new, and obviously, there's people who've been there since the age of 11. Anyway, so I joined the school. I'm a newbie, and kind of, I don't know how early in, but fairly early into joining the school, within a couple of weeks, I would say, a girl comes up to me and she asks me if I've been in trouble a lot, which is kind of a weird question just to come out of the blue. I mean, I don't really know this girl from Adam, but yet she just came out with this question. So I said no, but then I asked why she asked that, because obviously it's a bit of a weird question, kind of intrigued me. And she said, well, we've seen your Facebook and you have a lot of black friends, don't you? To which obviously I was gobsmacked, but I think it's indicative of how a lot of people maybe think, especially in rural areas, and maybe even in big cities, I guess, where there's multiculturalism, right? That you are intrinsically more likely to commit a crime if you're black. But what I didn't realize is that negative stereotype can bleed its way through to a white person just for having a friendship with black people, which I wasn't aware of. And so I kind of pulled her up on it, and I just said, look, having black friends is not indicative of you being in a criminal or not. That's just got nothing to do with it, quite frankly. And we spoke more about it. And what was shocking was that, she hasn't gone into this profession now, but when she said this, her aim after leaving school was to join the Met Police in London and to become part of the police force, which, and I think that's the problem, Jim, is that we look at the police force, right, and we look and you see what's happening in the States. But this stuff has happened in the UK as well, and I'm sure in Ireland as well, and every country basically. And we look at it as almost we look at it as different. But I think the problem is ultimately we have to remember that police men and women, police officers are human beings. And so just because they have a badge, that doesn't rid them of any prejudice that they may have before they got that badge, right? And so I think the only way to kind of stop what's happening in the police force is to stop it happening in society, basically. And anyway, we had the conversation, and I'm not sure if I changed her mind in that moment, but I think with time she's changed her mind, and I'm sure if she could take those comments back, she would do now. She made these comments when she was 16, 17 years old. I'm not saying she believes the same thing being a 24-year-old woman now, but it's just indicative to show how white people are so easily make the link between the color of someone's skin and personal kind of behavior, right? And yet when we look at it on the flip side, that link is not made. And obviously that link isn't made for white people because it's a ridiculous link to make in the first place, regardless of color. But what I mean by that is, if you look recently in the news, there's been Jeffrey Epstein, there's been Jimmy Savile, and loads of others. Even in my own family, we had a paedophile, which that will come out, I guess, in a future podcast that we've already recorded. But all of these men were middle-aged white men, yeah? Now, at no time has anyone questioned whether those men were pedophiles because they were white. Yeah, when I told my friends about my personal circumstance, no one asked me if the man in question was a pedophile because he was white. And obviously, why would they not ask that? Because it's a ridiculous kind of correlation to try and even draw. Okay, obviously, it has nothing to do with anything. But yet, when I've seen my friends act in a certain way or whatever it may be that kind of fulfills a negative black stereotype, that's used as the explanation, right? So the example is, for example, at school at Skegness Grammar, the black students that were there, their only option was excellence, academically speaking, because if they didn't perform and get straight A's and work tirelessly, they were easily dismissed as lazy because, that's one of the negative stereotypes. Oh, black people are lazy. So for them to rid themselves of that label, they had to outwork a white student, right? And the minute they didn't, not even act lazy, but just kind of work to the same level as maybe someone like me, then they would be called lazy. If some of the students, if they ever got into fights or got into like heated arguments, which happens at school, where like teenagers, there's hormones flying all over the shop, they would get called aggressive, because black people, especially black women, when they argue, they get called aggressive, right? But when a white girl would argue with someone at school, they would never get called aggressive. It was just, maybe it was her time of the month. Maybe she had a bad day. She woke up on the wrong side of the bed. We'd make all these excuses, right? But the minute one of the black girls at my school kind of got into an argument, they were labeled as aggressive girls because they were black. And it's to point out that hypocrisy.
There's a fantastic interview with Akala and Piers Morgan that was released last year. And Piers Morgan actually asked Akala, is the high rate of knife crime, which is attributed, or which a high percentage of is committed by black men, does their race have anything to do with that? Yeah. And then Akala is like, just please understand what you're asking me here. You're asking me, is their race an explanatory factor for their crime, right? Yeah. And then he goes on to say that black males disproportionately represent players in the Premier League. The 4 youngest people to do GCSEs in England were all black, and never
one of them had a higher IQ than Einstein.
Yeah. And never was that going, oh, is this because of his skin?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
And it's just important to know, it's important that interview is really great. I love Akala's calmness.
He's fantastic.
It's just so admirable.
He's fantastic, and also because he's so well read on the topic that he can argue. He can argue with you both on the humanitarian point of view, but also education. He's got the stats and the facts. But this, it's these things, it's these rhetorics that we some, not all of us, but some white people have, and I think some people don't even know that they have it, but they subconsciously think it. And so then when they see a black person acting that way, it's just like, oh yeah, okay, and it's like, oh, see, it, like that kind of validates my stereotype because look at them, that's what they're doing. And it's like, well, no, that maybe that was just like one guy who did one thing because of a million of reasons and factors. But none of those factors were because he was black. Let me tell you that much. But you know what I'm saying? But I think, and it's so important to kind of notice that thought process and pattern within ourselves and within our friendship groups. And I think, what we love with this podcast and what we try to promote is conversation. And I think what's really important, definitely go watch any Akala interview, to be quite honest, because he's had hundreds and they're all on YouTube and they're all fascinating. But there's so many other interviews with people like Cornel West, Killer Mike, and then you can even go back and further, and get old interviews and speeches from James Baldwin, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and so many others that are on YouTube these days. So it's easy access if people want to find that information, right? But I think it's really important that if you hear, as a white person, if you hear a friend make a derogatory statement like that, or, you're arguing a certain topic and they say something like, oh yeah, well, black people are lazy or whatever, to really pull them up on that point and to point out the hypocrisy of that statement And just like Akala did to question, are you really asking me, are you really telling me that their race is an explanatory factor for their behavior? Is that what you're telling me, that the way that they were born, the level of melanin that they have in their skin is what dictates how they have acted 50 years since their birth? And I think that's the biggest thing we can take from this kind of whole movement as white people is we should actively be having those conversations and not let things pass us by, not disregard people. Jim, I've heard a load of times where people have said to me, Seb, I completely agree with you. We should be having these conversations, so on and so forth. But what I think is, the reality is that our generation is the one that will bring about change, because we can bring our kids up to not be racist, basically, and it will be that generation where we see the biggest amount of change. And that, if your dad says something or your granddad says something, their person of that time, in a way, almost understand it because they grew up in that era, and you're not going to get anything out of them. So it's pointless having that conversation, which initially, I'll admit, I kind of agreed with. And then upon further reflection, just seemed ridiculous to me, because when you think about it, right? So if we take our grandparents, for example, as a generation, that generation did more than our generation ever has for the freedom of people in the world, not just in a country, in the world. They fought 2 world wars against highly racist regimes. Okay, they lost so many brothers and sisters for that cause. And so if you see your granddad or your grandma or whatever it may be kind of slip into those lazy rhetorics, I think it's important to bring up those conversations and to keep them true to their own sacrifice, because ultimately you can't, I do believe that anyone, no matter how entrenched they are in their views, is capable of change to some extent. Now, they might not go from being a KK leader to becoming, a Martin Luther King type of person. But I think like we've seen with the woman that you were talking about, another great person that was on the Joe Rogan show, Daryl Davis. I'm not sure if you've seen that interview, Jim, but he converted something like, I'm not sure if it's couple of hundred people from the KKK, like just by having conversations with them and having a beer with them. And he would put himself as a black man. He's a black man, and he's a blues player. And he put himself in danger, and he, like with the woman that you were saying, kind of converted these people because they realized, oh, this Daryl Davis is a lovely guy. How can I hate him? Just because he's black. And they would slowly and surely, some of them left the KKK. And this is now, this is happening right now. This isn't happening like 100 years ago. And so I just think that it's really important to kind of have that hope and not to give up on people, no matter how entrenched they seem in their views. And I can't remember who exactly said it. I think it might be Angela Davis. I'm not sure, but someone said a great quote that basically no one is born racist, right? And you learn racism. And so if it's learned, it can be unlearned. And I think that's a perfect way to look at the world and to look at people who maybe hold racist views, is that they weren't born into the world this way from day one, hating black people or Muslim people or whoever it may be, or homophobia even, or whatever it may be. They kind of learned that through rhetorics, through experiences, through people that they hang around with. And if they can learn something, you can actively unlearn something,
Absolutely. And I think it's important to move on to the idea of the conversations about these topics, because I think we value being right or not caving in to what we previously believed to be true much higher than empathy. And I'm reading this book similar to what Daryl Davis said. There's a book called We Need to Talk by Celeste Headley. And she's getting at this point, right, where we just need to listen to these people, just listen, And so the example I brought up with you yesterday, I don't want to bash you. I don't want to bash English people at all. But when I bring up Irish history, there's or the fact that English history is riddled with colonialism and racism. Often there is, but I got to defend this, but we did build these roads in India, or we did bring this and we did bring this. And it's the same idea where like I've seen people kind of try to justify the racist systems that we exist in also. And it's so much easier to do that than to just, all right, I'm just going to listen. I don't know. Like, and if you walk into a conversation and you're not willing to budge on what you believe to be true, what is the point in having the conversation?
Yeah, for sure.
This is the reason, like, I feel like we feel like we're being attacked when what we believe to be true is being criticized, when really the conversation should be constructive, like both ideas coming and just listening, active listening and response, rather than, oh, you say this, oh, so now I'm going to come back with this response because I heard this is a good response to this critique. And you're just, nobody's winning there. And I think why Daryl Davis and Dia Khan were so successful was because they're not trying to jam their opinion down their throat. They're just trying to connect them on a much deeper level than this, like on these words, this rhetoric.
And 100%. And I mean, I've been reading kind of before this whole movement happened. It just happened kind of to coincide. But I've been reading on the history of the Congo and Katanga and kind of the Belgian rule in there with King Leopold and so on and so forth. And yeah, we were speaking about this yesterday, Jim, but in UK history, you know, I've studied history at school. So in the UK curriculum, I should say, colonialism isn't taught at all. It just, we just skip over that bit. We go from ancient Greeks to World War II, and everything in between is just kind of conveniently forgotten about, right? And so I think you're 100% right, and maybe I have even been guilty of saying these things. But so when someone kind of critiques you, whether it's an Irish person or someone from, you know, from Africa or India, or I mean, unfortunately, the UK had the largest empire in the world, so there's a lot of people who rightfully take umbrage with UK history. Okay, and when you haven't read up on the topics, and you only kind of peripherally know what happened, like you say, you tried to create defense systems. Oh yeah, but without the British rule, India wouldn't have had all of their the railway system that they're famed for these days, and without this and without that and blah blah blah. But I think what it is that as well, you're right that we get defensive, but the other thing is that we think that our way of living is the only way of living. The Western ideals are the only way of living, right? And so I'm reading this book on the Congo and kind of and the history of it and the imperialism and their fight for independence and all of that stuff. And it talks about how the Congo wasn't a thing. In Africa, nations didn't exist. In Africa, you would have certain tribes that would kind of dominate a specific area. And then if another tribe wanted that area for whatever reason, hunting or whatever it may be, there would be some tribal warfare. And then, you'd get the next dominant tribe and they would dominate that area for however many years. And that would be the cycle of life. And to be honest, that's not too different from how we've worked in the Western world with wars. We would invade one country to try and get them and so on and so forth. But what is different is that they didn't have these rigid lines of borders and frontiers and this is a country. It was just like, no, we're kind of native to this land, but we don't own this land, and it's a fluid thing, right? And only reading this book has it become apparent to me that the way that we live in the Western world isn't necessarily the right way to do things. But I think what we've become to believe as UK kind of citizens, and this still happens now, right, with the US and the UK going to Afghanistan and so on and so forth, is that we're saving, quote unquote, these savages from themselves, and we're teaching them democracy and so on and so forth. Yeah, that's the line that we've still pushed to this day. Yeah, with the Syria bombings and so on and so forth. And it's like, well, maybe it's okay to have diversity in the way that people live, and that the way that continents see structures such as countries and society and so on and so forth. And what's devastating that you see in the Congo, and I mean this is just replicated all over Africa, unfortunately, is that these people who by and large were happy with the way that they were living, they come, whether it's British or Belgian or the French or Italians or the Spanish, they would come over, enforce kind of Western ideals on the native population through rape and pillage and I mean just ungodly amounts of violence. And then we would up and leave once there would be a war for independence, and we would leave them in a lurch. Do you know what I mean? Because it wasn't their system of living anyway. And I think that's something that UK people, because unless you're really invested in history, you just don't see, because we're not taught it, Jim. That's the ultimate fact. And And it's something important to say that whilst World War One and Two were great things, and we can be proud of what we did as the UK in those wars, those two wars alone don't absolve the UK from hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of violence and imperialism and colonialism, right? And it's this old quote that I've seen knocking about, which I love more and more each day, which is you have the right to you have the personal responsibility to be more ethical than the society you grew up in. And I'm going to add kind of a little prefix that more ethical and educated. And so if our school systems aren't going to teach us about imperial rule in the UK, then I think it's up to us to learn about it individually. And to, you know, you don't have to read a book. If a book's not your thing, you don't have to, but there's plenty of documentaries on it, of interviews and little, you can watch a little 10-minute video on YouTube, which will explain it clear enough, really. I just happen to love history, so for me it's kind of a passion. But if you don't do that, I think it's hard to understand the grievances, because that's the thing for these, for someone who is now a Black British citizen, these grievances are kind of come all the way back from centuries. And the same with you, we were talking with you, weren't we, that even though you didn't kind of personally suffer from the potato famine yourself, you still kind of feel that grievance because it happened to your ancestors 100 or 200 years ago. And I don't think UK people, the English people, pay enough attention to that at all.
I think it just requires some openness, when these things are discussed. And very rarely do I hear, Jesus, like, that must have been absolutely awful. I can't believe that happened. Tell me more. Or what happened after this? And it's always like, I got to defend this. And so what you say, you have to, in this case, you have to do your own research because the school system won't provide it. You could still do your own research and still find resistance because it's going against what you believe to be true. Mm. And so this is why it really does require someone to go, okay, let me listen and let me empathize. Like, stop trying to justify, just go, oh, Jesus.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, it kind of links neatly onto the topic of Black History Month. And I've got my problems, my issues with Black History Month. I mean, in the UK, I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's in October, and in the US it's in February. And my problem with it is, Jim, is that in the UK, I don't want to speak about the US, but in the UK, at the very least, in my personal experience, Black History Month, basically what that meant was all of Black history, which is basically human history, because, they are part of the human race, even though some people don't want to admit that they are. And Black people were the first ever humans to ever exist. We all emanated from Africa. So, I mean, Black history is as long as human history is. Yet, for me, in my personal experience, Black history was kind of consigned to October. And throughout the rest of the year, when we'd be learning about the suffragette movement or World War One and Two, we wouldn't be taught about Black history in those specific kind of periods of time. So, for example, we would learn about World War One and Two, but we weren't taught that many people in the Commonwealth came over and fought side by side with the British. We weren't taught that. And so then when you see that being depicted in the great film, for example, 1917, where you do see that, there was actually uproar in people complaining that, why are there Black and Hindu people in 1917? This is just quota. This wasn't real. Blah blah. It's because they're not aware of the history. I mean, the history would show you, if you do the research and you get taught correctly, the history will show you that they fought alongside us. And then in the later years, when the country was on its knees, came over in their droves from the Commonwealth to help build the country back up brick by brick. Now, I'm not saying that Black History Month should be eradicated, but what I am saying is that if we're going to keep hold of Black History Month, then we should use it as a way to illuminate and to shine a light on it more. But that doesn't mean that throughout the rest of the year we should ignore Black history. We don't have White History Month. Why? Because we're taught white history throughout the whole year. And that's my grievance with them. This is from personal experience. Maybe in other schools or in other counties, it'd be different. I don't know. But it's something that we should kind of recognize that is part of all its history. Black history is just history. It shouldn't be separate. And we shouldn't only be taught it in 1 month. Do you know what I mean? Because to try and cram in Black history in 1 month is just like, it's an impossible feat. So all you're doing is you're kind of scratching the very surface, and then the time November the 1st hits again, you're back onto like your UK white history, and we forget all about it until next year comes around, and we bet all we do is we just touch on the same topics. And so that's kind of my thing with Black history. Do they have Black History Month in Ireland at all?
If they do, I'm not aware of it, or it doesn't get a lot of play in terms of media. I obviously it's a much bigger deal in the UK and the US.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, go on. Sorry.
Like when I was talking to you yesterday, you were saying how like you were quite adamant about the failures of Black History Month, and I do think, while I agree with you that it should be across the spectrum, like across the year in terms of content, I'm sure it has also funded programs and museum exhibitions, etc., that have highlighted and initiated the discovery of Black history for a lot of people. So it's important to recognize that it has helped for sure. And it should be year round, but you shouldn't completely disregard what it's done either.
Yeah. I mean, that's a fair point. And I mean, it kind of all goes back into, I guess, I mean, it'd be interesting to see how this period of time gets taught in history in schools when we're like 60 and 70, or when our kids are going to school. It'd be interesting to see how the year 2020 is taught, and if they put a divide on it and they kind of say, this is Black history and this is white history. But I mean, I guess we'll see how that kind of unfolds. To kind of move on to a different topic, what I've also found really useful when talking to someone who may have racist beliefs and maybe openly kind of displays their racism is to come at them to talk about their interests and about what they like as people and their hobbies and so forth, and then to kind of educate them, if they don't already know, about what Black culture has done for that particular hobby or passion of theirs, right? So for example, if there was a young person, let's say, who maybe held racist beliefs but was an avid techno fan, to explain to them how techno came about, because it was an invention of Black culture. I mean, without Black culture, we would not have techno, and all the festivals and all the amazing artists that we have these days. They came from Black history. The same with hip hop and many other things. And I think that's kind of a really important point, is to recognize how much Black creation has actually influenced our lives now, and how
enriched our lives.
Yeah, and how poorer we would be without them. Mm-hmm.
And then when there's an instance where we could show a little bit of gratitude or a little bit of respect for that, we kind of shy away. We kind of go, it's not really my place,
Yeah, 100%.
Because like for me, man, I can't even imagine how worse my life would be without art created by non-white people. It's impossible to fathom. And I was only thinking about that yesterday as well. I can't just sit back passively and say, oh, sorry, this is happening, and still bump Kanye West how much I bump Kanye West, or J. Cole, or Kendrick Lamar, or half the movies that I watch.
I was going to say all of the movies. I mean, Jesus Christ, the amount of actors and directors are just, I mean, there's just too many to even list. The books, I mean, the music for me is the huge one, right? I mean, the music is just phenomenal. It's almost it's like almost like they were kind of just out there on their own almost. But I mean, sports, man, and this is the biggest thing, and it's like the biggest hypocrisy, and it's something that, to my shame, I haven't called out when I have seen it, for fear of for getting beaten up or whatever it may be. But you go to a football ground, okay, and now we know racism is rife in football, but it's not rife in football and it's rife in football because it's rife in society, and people believe that in football you're free to say whatever you want. So it's kind of like it just gets let out. It's like the gas. It's like the little valve, and people let their steam out at a football stadium, right? And you will see people celebrate a goal scored by a black striker. You know, I'm an Arsenal fan. Thierry Henry is, in my mind, the best Arsenal player there has ever been. Okay, an absolute god amongst men when it came onto the football pitch. Now he's black. So you would see Arsenal fans, for example, celebrate a goal that he would score and defend him vehemently against their rival fans, say that he's the best player in the world at his peak, and so on and so forth. And then they would racially abuse a rival black player. And it's just like, how can you live? How can that hypocrisy kind of exist? Like, how can you not see that? Whereby, for you, Thierry Henry or Sol Campbell, Patrick Vieira, Ashley Cole, you know, they're your gods. You worship these people every Saturday. It's like church. You go, you pay your money, you worship them. But then Didier Drogba scores against you, and you call him the N-word, and you do monkey chants, and so on and so forth. And it's like, I just can't. I don't know. I just can't fathom that. I really can't.
Yeah, it's a very good point, man. And I don't know how often it would be brought up to these people that to the people that do that. I mean, this is the thing. What I got from the documentary yesterday with Deacan also is that very often people who act in racist ways or openly act in racist ways, when you ask them just certain questions like you're asking now, they get uncomfortable because I think they know, like, they're uncomfortable with it because they feel that there is something not right with it. It's only because they've spent so much time around people that aren't questioning it that they feel it's okay, you know?
Yeah. And I mean, like, for example, myself, this is something that I was saying to you, you know, I think I have spoken up and I've been anti-racist when someone has said something personally to me or within a circle where I feel comfortable. But where I'm going to try and make that step further is, you know, if I do see that from now on in a football field, in a football stadium, or wherever it may be, to take a stance there and then, and not be like, oh, they're a bunch of racists, I don't know them, they're not part of my friendship group, and just kind of like take the easy way out, you know? That's something that I've definitely learned from this, because we can all improve. And this isn't to say that I'm perfect and that I've always been anti-racist and this, that, and the other. There's so much more work that I can do, for sure. And that's one of the big things, is where you kind of see crowds of people where it might not be at a stadium, it might be in a pub, yeah, or wherever it will be. But if you see someone kind of say, oh, you fucking black, blah, 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 because they missed a penalty, to call them out on that and go, are you fucking stupid? Like, are you really going to come out with that comment? I mean, you can say that they're a bad football player. Okay, fair enough, because that's got nothing to do with the color of their skin. But if you're going to start using racist slurs, now we've got a problem, for sure. And I think, the other thing, man, that we haven't really touched on is black beauty and how much that has influenced our society these days. I mean, you only have to look at the Kardashian family, whether you agree with them and you're an avid fan of their TV show or not. I mean, it's undeniable that they have made millions, if not billions, off their aesthetic, which has been inspired by black beauty, and which was in previous years was condemned. You know, in previous years, if you were a woman and you had big lips, a big bum, big boobs, that was seen as ugly, right? It wasn't long ago. I think it was only the 2000s, where in the noughties, where the Kate Middleton aesthetic was what everyone wanted to be, the Keira Knightley aesthetic, which was, white, very skinny, and very traditional kind of white features. And that's not to say that should not be deemed as beautiful now. Everyone has their own choices, of course they do. But I think we should recognize how much white people and I mean really famous and really successful business people like Kylie Jenner, who is, I think, the youngest self-made billionaire, off a lip brand that she makes, which actually enhances like, and kind of like makes your lips look bigger. I don't know how, I don't know what the science is, but that's what she's made her billions on. is black beauty. And yet you hear, unfortunately, you do hear people say, oh, black people are ugly, this, that, and the other. And you go, but yet their girlfriend or whatever it may be, or the girl that they're pining over on Instagram is showing all of these black traits. Do you know what I mean? And it's, again, it's to point out that hypocrisy and to go, okay, so you think Kim Kardashian's really beautiful, and that's fine. That's your personal opinion. There's no problem with that. But do you realize that this, and this, and this actually comes from, its origin is from black beauty? Like, are you aware of that fact? And just to kind of see, like you said, to not to make them uncomfortable on purpose, but to kind of point out that hypocrisy and to make them maybe reflect on their viewpoints and their belief systems.
Yeah, like, just to mix this in with your previous point, I do believe that we have different roles to play in this, meaning that we have different strengths, and that sometimes it may be a better approach for someone to engage or to approach racism in such a way, and then another way. Because from what I see with Dia Khan and with a lot of other people, they are having success with these kind of conversations. But I've also heard that, like, straight up, justified anger can also do this, but I think it depends on how you do it and in the context. And this is the thing. Like, it takes a good scoping of the situation, and I don't know. I guess what I'm trying to say is that maybe we could ask ourselves, how do we think this? How could we best improve this situation? And sometimes it might be with, like, this very very accurate illustration of hypocrisy. Or do you see the differences here? Do you see why this is racist here and it's not racist here? But then also there is just anger out there, and justified anger as well, and that needs to be expressed also.
I mean, perfect. Yeah. I mean, I was just going to ask you how you thought, like, kind of like to tie this up, how you thought we could maybe go about, as white people go about this to try and make a better society and to help with the racism, help defeat the racism. And one point that we haven't really touched on just yet, but I think is really important is, the conversation is important, and the way in which you go about the conversation, like you said, to go about it calmly and to not just, attack someone, because once you attack them from the get-go, they're just going to put up they're just going to close down, and they're not going to listen to anything you're saying. But I think another thing that we can do, which Killer Mike and so many other people in the black community have said, is the voting system, right? And ultimately, if you believe in democracy, that is, I guess, the principal way you change things ultimately, right? And I think we have to be nuanced in our thinking when it comes to voting and our political leaders. Okay. And what I mean by that is I have friends who have voted Conservative. I voted Conservative when I was 18, or the first vote that I did, I voted for David Cameron, which I've since regretted because he brought about Brexit and so on and so forth, but we won't get into that. But I've seen people vote for Conservative. I have friends who voted Conservative. I have friends who voted for Brexit. That's not to say that they're racist people, but we have to understand that there were some people who voted for Brexit and so on, where there were certain racial undertones within that voting system, right? Now, what I think is important to recognize is I have seen some people, since this has all happened with the George Floyd and so on, lamenting Boris Johnson for his inaction and his kind of wishy-washy stance on the whole issue. And I mean, I'm not sure if some people are aware, but the UK actually sell the riot gear to the US police. We sell the rubber bullets and the vests and so on and so forth. And so there's been a lot of people calling for Boris Johnson to stop that, because ultimately that is, I mean, we're seeing these terrible videos of police brutality over there in the US. And he, as would be expected if you did your research on him as a man, as who he is as a person, hasn't come out to say anything against Donald Trump or what's happening in the US. And I think what I'm trying to say is that, not to say that if you vote for the Conservatives you're racist, because I don't believe that to be true. And in fact, when that rhetoric was getting stated by a lot of left-wing people when the vote came through, I was uncomfortable with, because I don't think that's the case. I don't think that it's as it's as black as white as that. If you vote for the Conservatives, then you're a racist. I don't think you can say that. But there will be some of those people within that constituency who maybe have racist viewpoints. And I think it's important for us to do our research on our political leaders when we're at the time of voting, and to do our research in not just on their policies, because ultimately policies are hypothetical, right? When someone kind of gives their manifesto, it's what they would bring about in their best case scenario. But we all know that no one has ever completely kind of completed their manifesto. It's just an impossibility. But you can read, for example, Boris Johnson, he had a column, I want to say in the
Telegraph, I think.
The Telegraph, yes, exactly, and where he made some outlandish racist comments. And I have a few here, Jim, that I would just like to quickly read out, just to kind of point out this is the man who now we're hoping has all of a sudden changed his viewpoints and is now the Nelson Mandela for the UK. I mean, listen to some of the things that he says. It is said that the Queen has come to love the Commonwealth, partly because it supplies her with regular cheering crowds of flag-waving pickaninnies. No doubt the AK-47s will fall silent. The Pangs will stop their hacking of human flesh. The tribal warriors will all break out in watermelon smiles to see the big white chief touch down in his big white British taxpayer-funded bird. The best fate for Africa would be if all the old colonial powers or their citizens scrambled once again in her direction, on the understanding that this time they will not be asked to feel guilty. And that was just a few. There's loads more. And it's just to say, look, if you're going to vote for someone, vote for them on their policies, of course, but also vote for them on the strength of who they are as a human being. And if you're not a racist person, but you're going to vote for someone who's racist, and then you're going to be surprised when they, ultimately act racist, I think that kind of shows that you haven't done your research. And I think it's really important for us to when we go to the voting booths, to know who and what we're voting for implicitly.
Also, priorities. What I think was said, which I agreed with, was that by no means was everyone who voted for Brexit racist,
of course,
but that race probably wasn't a big issue for them, because they must have saw what was happening, why a strong percentage of people, how they were acting, what they were saying, what the rhetoric was. And it wasn't just Brussels democracy and et cetera, et cetera. There was just straight up racist comments being made. Having said that, also watching that documentary yesterday and seeing what can happen, like there is no never too gone, in my opinion, and seeing people who are heads of neo-Nazi organizations in the States now completely renouncing the behavior, trying to live it day by day, good actions, trying to do the opposite what they were doing. It's important to scald Boris for them comments, but also give him an opportunity to say, okay, here, are you going to show us that you can change?
Yeah.
And right now he isn't. But to me, I don't like. There are much smarter people than me that could say, oh, we think this is the best approach for Boris, or we think this is the best approach for Trump. I don't know, but I know that the people who have helped neo-Nazis convert, maybe they should be asked about this,
Yeah, for sure. So, I think we can tie up there, Jim, unless there's any points that you haven't brought up that you wanted to, that we've missed.
Yeah, there's just one interesting thing that I was talking to my Dermo about, and that I asked you yesterday, and I think it's important for us to ask ourselves, is that how far are we willing to go? So we hate the idea of seeing George Floyd being murdered, but are we just going to forget about it in 2 weeks and then just retweet something, maybe when it's a year anniversary or something? Or are we going to go to a protest? Or are we willing to, lose a day's work for it? Are we willing to lose our job for it? How important is it for us? Because, there's a thing that they call, that I came across in public policy, where they say NIMBY people, meaning not in my backyard. So it's like, no, I can't stand for racism, except when a movement is attacking racism and it affects my daily life, So like, oh, I can't get the bus to work today. No, it's like I support the drivers' rights or public servants' rights, but when they strike and I can't get the tube to work, that's not cool.
Yeah.
And so I don't know, like I'm asking myself currently about it as well, where how far am I willing to go? And I just think it's an important interrogation to go, okay, this is important addition to me. This made me feel horrible. Like just watching a person die,
be murdered
for 8 minutes when he says he can't breathe and there's just 4 people watching. And this wasn't a once-off occasion. I remember I wrote a paper in my university about Eric Garner, who said the exact same thing. He said, I can't breathe. And he died later. And I don't know, like, I just think that it's a shame that because we are so filled with horrible events happening on a daily basis, I think inevitably we become a bit numb to it, and inevitably we just go, okay, next news cycle.
Yeah.
But if this is something that really shakes you to the core, realize that you can do things about it. And even if it's just having a chat with your uncle who retweeted this really dodgy article on Facebook saying like something like all Muslims are rapists, something like this, it can help, you know?
Yeah.
But yeah, like that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to ask myself how far I'm willing to go. I don't know if you're willing to answer this question at this point, but I think it's an important question nonetheless.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I know you're going to protest today. Is that right? After this, I think.
Correct.
Yeah. And I mean, we've got a march. Well, actually, it's a memorial for George Floyd in Madrid tomorrow. So we're going to that. What I've taken from this is that I'm now really going to speak up when I see it. Be that if I see it from a stranger in the street who I don't know them from Adam, or I see that in my friendships, because I find, I mean, this is just me personally, I find it easier to bring it up and to kind of fight against it within friendships and within, not that my friends are racist, thankfully, but within people that I'm familiar with, whereas, you know, it's a lad on your football team or wherever it may be, but I find it more difficult and more daunting to do that with an unknown quantity, because ultimately you don't know how that will end. But you know what I'm like on sexual abuse. I think it's imperative that we police ourselves before we start questioning the police. And I think that means that not only you doing that within your own group, you know, your own kind of community, but you do that outside and where you maybe do feel uncomfortable, but that in some cases is even more important, because, you know, if I use the example of someone shouting a racist slur because a black person missed a penalty in the FA Cup final, for example, well, if he feels that confident to say that in public, it's probably because his friends, if they don't feel the same way, they're definitely not bringing him up on it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so if that's the case, then me hoping that one of his friends will eventually one day say something to him is, you know, it's pissing in the wind, really. So then that's the way I see it. And so now I'm like, well, you know, obviously his friends aren't doing anything, so I'm going to take it upon myself and I'm going to say something. And you know, it's not saying that I'm going to beat him up or anything like that, but I'm going to try to just say, at the very least, if it does nothing else, but just so he knows that he can't be making those statements in public, at the very least, then that's something, right? And also, so it's something to quickly, before we finish up here, to recognize how nuanced racism can be. Because I've had a lot of conversations with my Spanish friends, and because we don't have police in Spain shooting black people in the streets or kneeling on their necks for 8 minutes and 45 seconds, a lot of people in Spain think that racism here doesn't exist or isn't as bad. And I've heard that being said in England, by the way. I've heard that on the news channels where people have questioned, is it as bad in England?
Same in Ireland.
Same in Ireland, right? Okay, cool. I think it's a worldwide thing. We see the atrocities happening in the US and they're ghastly, and we go, oh, that's the standard. So as long as we're not doing that, we're groovy. And I think it's really important to note that little things and maybe things that you maybe need to pay a bit more attention that maybe aren't as obvious as someone kneeling on someone's neck for 8 minutes or 45 seconds, that still constitutes as racism. Okay, the fact that in Spain and in Italy, I know this from personal experience, black people are seen as second class citizens because they're not integrated in society in any form whatsoever. It's almost impossible to have a black a Spaniard or an Italian go to school and have a multicultural school. I have been in 3 or 4 different offices now, different companies. Not once have I worked alongside a black person. Okay, and that filters through where people think, oh, there's not much racism in Spain. It's like, no, they're not integrated in Spain, so you don't see it, but it's still there. Okay, and I think it's really important to bring that up as well, so that people don't fall in to the lazy belief that their country is free of racism because the police don't kill black people in the streets. I think that's really important that we're nuanced in that in our thinking, and we're vigilant. That's one thing I'd definitely say.
One thing that finally comes to mind is that a lot of people, well, when you see the looting that is happening, to remember that, I remember I heard the quote was something like, the looting is the voiceless speaking, because these people haven't been given platforms. These people have just been oppressed and repressed, and this is their way of speaking. So, it was a combination of what Martin Luther King did, what Michael X did, as well as the looting in the States that helped some policies get passed. Because if you have no way to speak, you're going to speak. You're going to try get them to listen whatever way you can.
Yeah.
And I think that's important to understand. I'm not like permitting looting either. I'm just trying to say, like, be empathetic and understand why these people are doing it.
Yeah.
These people don't have a voice, and they're just trying to tell you, hey, I have no voice here. I'm sick of it. You know?
For sure. Yeah, for sure. Brilliant stuff. I mean, guys, if you've listened all the way through, then we really thank you for it. It's been something that has been weighing on us, and we've wanted to get this podcast out, but we want to do it in the right way. And hopefully we've done that. And we were already planning to anyway before this whole episode and this period of time happened, but we are planning to get people onto the podcast who can maybe talk about it from a first-hand experience, and we will continue to do so. We're not going to just we're going to keep true to our promise. Like Jim said, how far are we willing to go? This was one of the things that we as a podcast are willing to do and will do, is to have black people and maybe people who are maybe racist, who have maybe converted, talk about their experience, and we'll do that for as long as we can, and as long as people are willing to come onto the podcast. And guys, for anyone who's read this and listened to this and thought, what, I want to do some more kind of research on my own or whatever it may be, get a bit more clued up on the topic, the possibilities are endless, right? There's thousands of books. I'm sure you've seen them all been retweeted and put on Instagram, or what you can do, where you can buy them, what the books are. There's interviews. I'm an avid fan of Joe Rogan. Anyone who knows me knows that. But yeah, exactly. But he has great interviews with people like Daryl Davis, Dr. Cornel West, Killer Mike, Malcolm Gladwell, and I'm sure there's others who I've missed, but those people, I mean, some of them are 3 hours, some of them are 2 hours, some of them are 1 hour. But if you listen to those podcasts, that in itself will give you an education that almost no university course could give you. Then you can find on YouTube all of the other speeches and so on from people like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, James Baldwin, and so on and so forth. And on Netflix, even if it's fictional, to watch films and to watch series, which actually a lot of them unfortunately are based on truth and real stories, but to watch films and stories that aren't going to be easy viewing, but will kind of show you kind of the brutality of our ways and how it really negatively affects the human race. And if you do that, I think slowly but surely we will all become more empathetic to this cause. And hopefully, if we all do that, then maybe one conversation at a time, we can kind of fight against the wave of racism. At least that's my kind of hope for the future anyway. All right, guys, brilliant.
Sure. We can also provide some links in the show notes of maybe some organizations or some articles in the UK and Ireland that people might want to listen or read about.
For sure. Okay, guys. So thank you so much for listening. Keep safe. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. We've got many more to come out, so keep on the lookout for those. But keep safe and hopefully do the right thing. Right. Peace out, guys. Thank you.